Tales from Juthos, Part 9. As they stepped out of the tunnel, Dogan looked up, squinting around the enormous chamber. Home. Or at least once it had been. It felt so long ago now. He thought that with everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, it might provide him with some level of comfort to be on familiar grounds once again. Not so, it would seem. The chamber was vast, roughly cylindrical in nature, were it not for the large, buttress-like structures that stood against its sides. In times long past, the walkways within these buttresses served as access to the many galleries within the walls. The dwarves that once took sole rulership over this mountain were once meticulous in their maintenance of this place, knowing full well of the deeper significance that it held. Even beyond the vital flow of air that made the densely packed underground space livable. Nowadays, these wide galleries served as the foundation of many hovels that grew out from the side of the walls like fungus on a decaying tree stump. Yet, as he looked here and there and spotted the telltale scattered detritus of a ruin, it seemed that many of these hovels had already begun to fall. Each year, despite their prayers, the wash of ice and water that fell as the seasons changed would claim any number of homes. The at times colossal weight of ice-cold water crashing down from the vaulted ceiling and shattering weakened timber as easily as it did the lives who took refuge beneath it. Dogan remembered well the fear that came with springtime, of the terrible creaking that echoed around the space as the great icicles began to thaw. He remembered many sleepless nights, staring out through the holes in his ceiling, his Seyrat ears picking up on even the tiniest of faults. He remembered the endless anxiety that he would be next. He remembered the day anxiety became hope. The great chamber was covered, you see, in many ways resembling something close to the interior of a gigantic lighthouse. Though there were no windows at the highest point in the tower, nor a great pyre, just a vast open holes that caught the wind against the sloping conical structure that started in the ceiling and made its way downwards, flaring out again near the base like some lopsided hourglass. A true mastery of masonry. If this chamber was the throat of the mountain, this was surely the giant's tongue. All four winds would find themselves captured and directed downwards into the tunnels in this manner, as the sloping sides of the tongue directed the high wind downwards towards the belly. To this day, none of the poor folk dared lay a finger upon this tongue, nor to build nor otherwise, for even in this time of the sun goddess and her chosen king, old superstitions held that this great column was in its own way blessed, which in some ways, though the dwellers of Throat would never admit to it before the judgment of the bright priesthood, made the structure holier still. They knew far better than most that blessings were hard things to come by. Further, given the influx of heretics into the slum in recent years, or rather, priests who would not forsake their gods for the sake of this new kingdom, there grew now a clergy of dissent within the lowest orders. A clergy which held very dearly to what little divinity they had. He had heard, via the mewlings and cries of prisoners in Ezradis's hold, that the elder now counted himself amongst their number. Ever since the dockmaster had learned of his ability to glean insight from the pace of people's hearts, he had been stationed as a semi-permanent figure in her more involved interrogations. Indeed, his attendance at the horrifying sessions was surpassed only recently by the young Captain Adaril. Dogan hated the man. But then again, he rather hated all of them. Apart from Angie, that is. He bit his lip to stop the tears. He could do this. This time he was going to save her. After having made their way but a short distance into the great chamber, the incline of the embankment that sloped down into the running meltwater grew gentle enough for them to awkwardly climb their way up to its surface. Unable to balance or steady himself properly without the full use of his arms, Dogan found himself yanked upwards cruelly by Onul's men to hasten his pace. "So this is how I return home," thought the Seyrat, strung up and dangling like a prized fish. He wasn't the only one who was having difficulties, however. Sildan too was struggling for purchase on the muddy bank, his false leg impeding his climb without the finer control of an ankle or toes. He could hear a number of the group remark at this beneath their breath, the extent of his injuries unknown to them, hidden as they were beneath his trouser leg and boot. They could see the dark blood seeping through the hastily tied bandages, however, worsening still with the continued exertion. The two men who followed behind him called up to the giant, asking if he had encountered trouble in the tunnels. In times past, various creatures had been known to make their homes in the network. Strange, unnatural things that fed on the detritus of Gren city folk, or even on the people themselves. Many living today within Throat had recent memories of losing someone close to such a beast. When Angie had first come to Gren, she had made her way to the wind tunnels and their unfortunate residents in hope of hiding herself away from the rest of the world. There was much that Dogan still didn't know about the nature of her situation, but he knew enough to grasp that her fear was both great and real. She had turned up at the docks with nothing but the clothes on her back, having spent what coin she had securing passage. She was near starving, having lived for a month on scraps left over by the crew, and her unusual appearance had earned her far more superstition than sympathy. Turned out at every turn. Indeed, it had only been after some months' recovery from her flight and fear that she had started to seem human again. When the poor folk had first found her, she was feasting on the remains of a freshly slain tunnel beast. She was nearly slain herself, thought to be some wight or ghoul, had she not spoken up and pleaded sanctuary with the men. It wasn't a sudden acceptance by any means. A dog-eyed and cruelly scarred girl popping up in the lower tunnels was remarkable enough in of itself, and that was before you counted for her apparent ability to lay low the beasts that other men feared. She had parted ways with him then, merely asking for blankets, so she might keep herself warm. Then, later, she had resurfaced and intervened in an attack on beggars making their way home from Gren's streets after curfew. This time, some fresh horror had been predating on the slum dwellers from vantage points on tunnel ceilings. People had been going missing for several weeks in this manner, pulled up from the ground and devoured. The beast seemed to exhibit no small measure of intelligence, and moved from tunnel to tunnel with each strike, playing games with those that sought to root it out. Dogan had been one of those beggars. He had thought himself safe, relying upon his ears to forewarn him of the threat. Yet the beast made no sound. No sound at all. It was an impossible creature, long of leg and translucent in its flesh. Some nights he swore he could still see that singular oval and goat-like eye staring down at him from his bedroom ceiling. He remembered the long barbs of its tongue shooting down out of the darkness and skewering his companion in the neck, piercing right through the flesh as the snake-like appendage wrapped around his head and pulled the man back towards a gaping insectoid maw. He remembered a flash in the dark, and an echoing scream of pain as a blade shot out of the blackness and severed the beast's tongue. He had hidden his face and backed away into the wall, mind addled by the intensity of the screaming. Some while later, when he had regained his sensibilities, he had looked upon Angela II of the Dravenfall family for the first time. Dark, messy hair, torn and frayed clothes, covered from head to toe in tunnel filth and fresh viscera. She had been holding a severed limb, freshly torn from the beast's socket, held aloft for inspection by a blackened and malformed arm. He could make out the teeth, the long claws of her hands, the curious and insightful expression on her face as she surveyed the remains of the monster. She had been taking notes beneath her breath, all the while apparently indifferent to the headless corpse of his companion that lay not 4 feet from where she stood. Dogan remembered realizing he was alone with this woman. The other beggars having long since fled, and the dawning horror that he had been left alone with a monstrosity that would one day be his closest friend. "Hey! Who's that down there with her nose patrol?" came a voice from a shack nearby. "No, not the big one, the one in front of him on the rope. Look! There he is!" Oh, good. It had already begun. "Can we hasten closer to the centre, please? I'm sure you would sooner be done and gone," Dogan pleaded to Anul's back. The man turned around with an unto pleasant grin upon his face. "And deny you what's yours? Wouldn't dream of it," he responded. As they trudged on through the bottom layers of the chamber, stepping between poorly constructed wooden shacks through muddied streets, Dogan could hear more and more cries of his recognition. They were close to the southern buttress here, and the route they had taken into the slums was often travelled. It was not altogether surprising, then, that the ground floor was still tightly packed even at this late stage in the season. The bulk of these structures would be washed away in the coming months by the meltwater from above. Higher positions on the wall were fought hard for and tightly packed. So many newcomers to these slums were forced to build down here for this reason. They'd need to prove themselves useful or make fast friends if they were to gain a home of more permanence. Or else strike a deal with one of the local gangs, which was neither a pretty nor a desirable option to be left with. Dogan looked up at the side of the chamber walls. It seemed that the bridges and hangings that served to extend the structures outwards from their ancient galleries grew further by the year. It was akin to looking up through the canopy of an undisturbed jungle forest. Save that the vines were ladders, the branches walkways, and the darker clumps of flora are massive buildings clustered around a particularly sturdy support. Despite himself, when the opportunity to do so arose, he couldn't help but gaze southward. There wasn't any debris left over on the ground. He had expected that. It had been about 2 full years since the last elder had died, which was more than enough time for the slum dwellers to pick apart any materials left of any value. Post flooding would have taken care of the rest. All that remained now was a couple of loose supports that ran down the edges of the walls. Dogan squinted. It looked like flowers had been taken down from the mountain's surface up above and interlaced with the loose ropes as a sign of remembrance. An unusual display of sentimentality within a place as hard up as this. So that was all that remained now. Dangling flowers and a gap. Dogan's heart sank. "Murderer!" came a cry from behind him. He had just a moment to react before he felt an impact on the back of his head. The force of the blow sent him reeling forwards, and without both of his hands free to catch himself, he landed face first in the mud with a cry of shock and pain. "Oi!" shouted out Silden. Though his head hurt, he could see the captain twist around and call up to the source of the object. Arms and shoulders back, and hands curled into fists. Dogan scrambled back up to his feet, watching a stone splash into the mud in the space where he had so recently occupied. More angry voices were calling down, and the Seyrat dived for what cover he could find against the wall of a nearby shack as a third and fourth object went sailing close by. He saw Silden get struck in the chest and curse aloud as the stone tumbled off him and onto the floor. "Damn it! Ernest! Whatever your cursed name is, call him off! We'll be dead men if they strike us true in the skulls from that height!" The captain yelled, but Anul himself was taking cover, as were many of his men. "You think I could tell him what to do? You should have picked your mates more carefully. Little bastard had this coming," he responded, eyes searching above him for more close-flying projectiles. All around them, shutters were opening up and walkways were filling with angry faces and calls of murderer and traitor. Dogan had expected word to spread of his return, but not this fast. He tried to hide himself behind a nearby beam of rotting timber. However, a powerful yank on the rope which bound him pulled him straight back out into the open. He looked up at the man who held the other end, who was trying to make it as clear as possible that it was he who had made this offering to the people above them. "I'm sorry, boss, but I ain't risking my life for the likes of him," he called out. "He could die in the gutter, serves him right." Dogan was struck by another stone to jeers of cruel celebration above him, this time just above the hip, which buckled inward beneath the impact. He could feel the muscles and bones in his spine twist and spasm unnaturally, as they were suddenly forced to compensate for the movement. Another still glanced off his elbow. "You idiot! That witch will see us all dead if he doesn't return!" Ernol called out in response, but he didn't move from his spot near the edge of the building, his hands clasped over the back of his head to protect himself. Dogan could taste blood. He tried to run but couldn't, settling instead to hobble towards his leash holder, hoping groggily that a closer hiding spot would prevent being pulled back out into the open again. Yet as he drew close, he was met with a swift kick to the chest that knocked him backwards once more. This time on his back, his ears flaring open to hear a sound he hadn't heard in a very long time. Above the curses of the slum dwellers, high above the hanging hovels at the very roof of the chamber, it was a familiar sound. One that brought with it memories and feelings that he had very much hoped to leave in his past. It was the ice, slowly cracking as it melted on the ceiling. The sound of icicles that would soon fall down the throat. Yet closer still, somewhere maybe 20 feet to his left, there was another cracking. Harsher. He could make out the individual splinters. Then a strange musical language, uttered in a deep and guttural voice. Above him, he saw a number of bridges and hovels sway. The wind was picking up. But wind only ever moves downwards in the throat, Dogan thought. How could this? Then, as a wall of white noise swelled, he reflexively folded down his ears and clasped his hands to his head in preparation. There was an explosion of sound, as the air collapsed and the deep boom of the shock reverberated through his very bones. He looked up to see men and women gripping onto railings and ropes to secure themselves. Dirt and unfastened timbers flew from the tops of hovels, as well as crude tools and other personal effects that had been left outside. Then he heard the heavy fall of feet on mud as Silden came, above his head holding a door that had been ripped from its hinges as a shield. Yet the wind seemed to curl and bend around the shield, visible currents of air, like a localized tornado that wrapped around its length. Here and there, stones and other objects, thrown or otherwise, were falling close to the door only to be cast aside at the last moment by the force of the wind. Silden strode over Dogan, his very form seeming to flow in the otherworldly current, his beard and coat rippling with a strange sort of energy, his glass eye now a cold and turbulent grey that seemed to feed into whatever effect he was maintaining above him. Deftly, he climbed the simple staircase with a single step to kick the man who was holding Dogan's bindings directly in the face, the awestruck man simply crumpling beneath the force. The rope went slack, and Silden used his foot to kick the length back towards Dogan as he turned around and looked down with an expression that told him all that he needed to know. Dogan slipped the loosened knots from his hands and pulled himself up. "You need to get to the center, right?" the storm giant asked. Dogan didn't remember ever telling him that, but he simply nodded. "Then grab on."